Fabio is an MD. He's a clinical researcher, and he also happens to have had COVID-19 in the last 3 months.
Yes.
How are you doing? How are you doing now after 3 months?
Much better. Finally, still a little bit, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but definitely on the mend.
Good. I'm glad to know that we've got you more fully present to help us figure this out.
I'll try my best. Thank you.
All right. Now we've got all this medical science that we've developed in the last century. Why are we still struggling to figure this thing out after 6 months, basically, of contending with it?
Well, I can only share my own thoughts on that, and I think that has a lot to do with the way we do medicine. We have this very interesting way of looking at science, where we assume at any given moment, we assume that what we see and what we understand at a specific time is all that there is to understand. And we act on that knowledge as if it was absolute and truth. So, as an example, we saw that a lot of people in China ended up going to hospital, not being able to breathe, and we assumed that this was a respiratory virus, and that people needed ventilation in order to survive. We thought at the beginning that this was transmitted by direct contact rather than by aerosol or suspended air droplets. And therefore, we didn't think that using masks would be helpful. And, social distancing and washing your hands could have been sufficient to stop the spread of the virus. So we issued guidelines in those terms. And we issued therapeutic protocols according to those observations. And that explains a lot of the inconsistencies or shifting messages that we're seeing coming from Fauci and other experts over the last 5 months.
Sounds like there's a cultural bias that we have towards this empirical approach to, or this evidence-based research that is blinding us from really looking more carefully at all of the data. It's like a quick fix. It's like if we can stop the deaths, we've solved the problem, we win. When there's a whole nother realm of analysis that could be being done that we're not doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. There is a little bit of a bigger issue here, and the bigger issue is that the study and the practice of medicine has really changed over the last 20, 30 years. So, we need to remember that medicine is a very new science to a certain extent. Medicine has been around since the birth of humans, right? Since we kind of started as a species, we always kind of dealt with disease, and we tried to heal from disease in different ways. But medicine as a scientific process based on hard evidence only originates probably in the latter part of the 19th century. So, it's only with the generation of the germ theory from Pasteur that we actually started recognizing mechanisms, actual biological mechanisms by which disease happens. So in that sense, medicine is quite new. And medicine, since its inception, has always been struggling between 2 different schools of thought. And these 2 schools of thought are the empirical, they're divided between empiricism and rationalism. So, and this goes on since the times of in the 2nd century BC, Galenus was the first one to try and reconcile these two different schools of thought in medical practice. So the empirical or empiricism approach is that we only apply a deductive process. As I said, what we do, we establish as true, as completely and wholly true, what we know at a given moment. So it's based on a logical positivism, right? So if I know that something works, I'm going to keep using it because I know it works. But that blinds me to the possibility of exploring new things, right? Or to evaluating different options for the same, to tackle the same problem from a medical perspective.
Right. It's essentially assuming a causal relationship when there might only be a correlational relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it may work for a while, but then at a certain point, without looking at the substructure, it might not work at all, and you don't have any idea why.
Right. So talking about coronavirus, the example is coronavirus is a respiratory disease, right? And this is what I base my knowledge on. Rationalism is the opposite process. So it is not based on a deductive process, it's based on an inductive process. So it starts from a belief, from an intuition, from a pattern recognition that might be either originating from a personal stance or from a belief system that might be religious, philosophical, a school of thought, all masters, and so on and so forth. The problem with that system is that although it is creative and it uses, has an opportunity to innovate and provide a tailored approach to a problem, what it does, it's dogmatic in the sense that it doesn't require an explanation. So in the 20th century, when modern medicine started, there was like this, medicine was called the medical art. A lot of doctors did clinical studies on their own, based on their own assumptions, on their own belief system. Medical practice was very diverse. So it was literally like a stroke of luck whether you went to one doctor versus the next, and they would use completely different approaches to the same disease, and maybe even give you completely different diagnoses. That became a problem when we were presented with an aging population, with a resurgence of chronic and inflammatory diseases, and with a strain on health systems. So we couldn't just have, in the medical field, a free-for-all where all treatments could be used for absolutely everything, and every option could be, considered in the same fashion or with the same weight. So we thought that a good way to go about that was to create this system of evidence-based medicine. So we start looking at the data we have, and we use that data to make decisions. The data comes from robust, randomized clinical trials, retrospective trials, reviews of the literature, and comes from a standardization of patients and disease measures. That works, but it only works on a general population perspective. It doesn't work on two fronts. It doesn't work on an individual perspective. So you still have a lot of people that, despite advancements in medical science, do not benefit from certain treatments. And also, it doesn't benefit innovation, because most of the new protocols are essentially an evolution from the previous one.
Right.
So there is no innovation, because we have eliminated the inductive process from the scientific process.
Right. As long as they get statistical results that they want, it's an issue of if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
To a certain extent, yes. Yes. And it has become so ingrained that not only this approach is taken by every single health authority in the world, it's taken by every single healthcare provider in the world, but it's also how medicine is taught in universities today. So I was reading, for instance, this paper that is kind of very interesting about the difference between empiricism and rationalism in medicine. And they were pointing out that one of the major lacks in medical education and scientific education today is the lack of the understanding of the history of medicine or the philosophy of medicine. So there is no study of ethics and philosophy. And therefore, we don't give new physicians the tools to apply judgment and a more intuitive approach to medical practice.
Mm-hmm. And I would see that sounds like that's problematic. You know, that you've got, from what I understand about intuitive approaches, if you have a lot of expertise, if you've been a doctor for 30 years and you've seen a lot of different things, you might intuitively sense something that the medical equipment doesn't even tell you. You know,
right.
But there's too many false indicators here that align with a pattern that I've seen before on patients that always had this. And, you know, so that doctor might be awesome at getting the right diagnosis intuitively, even though the equipment doesn't suggest it.
Right.
But unfortunately, that might not work out so well if he's wrong. And the insurance company says, well, you don't have any evidence to back up your stupid decision.
Well, it's because now we don't even allow research that is not evidence-based. So if a research project is not rooted in an evidence-based approach, is automatically discounted because the hypothesis needs to be rooted in something that we already know.
Oh, man. Right? So that is basically we're cutting off the search engine of right. our entire scientific community.
Right. It's like the difference between iPhone 1 and iPhone 11. It's fundamentally the same iPhone, but just with a better camera and a bigger screen.
Right.
You know, so it's a little bit the same for medical science, where the improvements and the innovation is incremental rather than being exponential or stepwise. Right.
Well, that sounds like it's not so good. Now, couldn't we just put these two systems together? I mean, my understanding of great scientists from history is that they always had some sort of intuitive impulse that gave them a theory, and then they used math or research to test it.
Well, I think that, you know, if you look at it in a broader sense, this applies to medicine in an acute way right now because we are dealing with a health crisis. But if you think about it, we actually facing this contrast between empiricism versus rationalism in most areas in society at the moment. And yes, I agree with you completely that the next step, if we want to survive and kind of, you know, flourish and get to the next stage of innovation, is actually find ways by which we can integrate and take the best out of those two systems, which are not opposing systems, they're actually complementary systems. And we only oppose them because it's easier to make them absolutes rather than integrated.
Yeah, this is a great point. I think when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about all the other ways that this very issue, this very philosophical or psychological duality shows up in all sorts of other realms. In finance, you know, the whole idea of mark-to-market accounting, you know, for being the tool, the weapon of choice for Enron, and how they basically deluded people. Like, oh, it's sort of, they were totally on the sort of the rationalistic or rationalism side of it, of going intuition. If they're going up, they must be worth more money, you know?
Right.
And that led to a horrible thing. Of course, we had the same thing happen with the .coms, right? There's this huge bubble of expectation with no strong data to back it up.
Right.
And so we've got these kind of these problems with this split of the mind of the modern mind, essentially.
Well, because the problem is that rationalism only works if it becomes dogmatic, right? So it needs to be unquestionable, because if you start questioning and applying empiricistic processes to a rationalistic thinking, you run the risk of contradicting your hypothesis. So a pure rationalistic approach only survives if it's not vetted by facts. On the other hand, a factual empiricistic approach only survives if you don't have any intuition and you don't introduce any point of innovation. What we have created in society, and to me that's the issue, is that we are seeking predictability versus instead of innovation. So, and that kind of pushes us into the empiristic approach versus the rationalistic approach.
It's kind of fear-based in a sense.
It's to a certain...
Or more fearful than curious.
It's fearful, and also it's a little bit self-defeating, because what we are seeing now is a lot of people migrating to unsubstantiated belief systems because they are more fulfilling from an emotional perspective, but they're not corroborated by facts. And people don't want to hear facts anymore. That's an active, we have an active movement against science, against culture, against education. It's, you don't need to know stuff. You just need to, kind of
memorize a bunch of facts. It's like education's not teaching people to think. It's kind of been possessed by empiricism in a way. It's like, if you can get the numbers necessary to get into the college and then get the numbers necessary to get the job, right, then I don't care how creative or thoughtful you are. That's what matters. And then you have all these people cheating on all the tests in order to get the numbers, because that's what they're being told to do, rather than I know how to think, I know how to question, I know how to hypothesize things and then test those hypotheses.
Yeah. And I witnessed, frankly, Andrew, I witnessed this shift in my own lifetime. So, when I went to university, medical school, we were still in the rationalistic process, or, original scientific thinking process, where we had a lot of notions, but then we needed to apply kind of a personal judgment in the way we filter those notions.
Yeah.
When I came out of university and I started doing, tutoring students and kind of doing some teaching when I was at university, when I was like working in the university, in the lab, those new students moved to a kind of factual, empiricistic based type of education. So they had multiple answer testing, they only had limited topics on each subject that were more practical and notion based. They were learning protocols instead of broad concepts. And therefore, yes, first of all, you can cheat more because you only need to learn by heart. You don't need to really think about anything. But also you become a lot more limited in your system.
I'm very much a believer in science, and I'm very opposed to a lot of conspiracy theories about, mind control and all these different things. But what we're talking about is essentially a form of mind control. It may not be coming from a centralized power of a cabal of people who know what they're doing, but it's like we're doing it to ourselves. We're basically de-educating ourselves in the way of 1984. The more you eliminate the opportunities to think, the more you eliminate the questions, the less you think. The more you become a pure empiricist, and the lazier we get, essentially, too, about questioning things.
Yes, it's Yeah, I agree. I think it's very insidious. I don't want to believe that this is the result of a evil mindset. I think it's literally based on our natural desire to predict and control the environment,
right,
and predict outcomes, which comes probably also, that's a completely different conversation,
right,
from a more anthropological mindset, kind of
or biological,
anthropological, and
neurological. So there's some more
yeah.
logical oligocals to this.
Yes,
But I was
absolutely.
going to say too that it's like the desire for automation to conserve glucose in the brain. It's like built in. It's like a built-in thing here. It's like, let's see how efficient I can make the system, which means that there is no innovation.
Right.
And yet we have this other side of us that is curious, that wants to know, well, is there a better solution to this problem? And I think brings us back to coronavirus.
Right.
Is there a better way to approach this disease if we look at it more clearly and hypothesize about how it may be working?
Right. And more broadly to medical science, because it is arguable that we had a lot of technological progress going on over the last 30 years, but we didn't have a correspondent medical advancement. If anything, people are actually dying more than they used to 20, 30 years ago. The life expectancy in the US has actually gone down instead of going up. The number of comorbidities is increased instead of decreasing. So actually, we are becoming we are a much more technologically advanced society, but we are a much sicker society.
Wow.
So there is something that we are not quite connecting. And I do believe that it's the lack of the sacrifice that we made for predictability over innovation that is blocking us from exploiting the opportunities that are in front of us, that are presented by the technologies and the advancement that we made. We just don't let ourselves use them because we don't want to introduce an element of risk that might disrupt the status quo.
Wow. Well, that's pretty deep, and it's pretty significant.
But that's another conversation altogether.
Another conversation. Now, let's get back to coronavirus and how to handle it. And if we're bringing in a more creative, intuitive side and buttressing it with the empiricism, from what we know about coronavirus today, how should we deal with it? What should we be doing at this point?
Well, first of all, we should probably investigate therapeutic approaches that are more targeted towards the virus itself. So, maybe we should use blood thinners. Maybe we should use antihypertensive drugs. Maybe we should use ACE inhibitors as competitors to the virus. It's interesting that, for instance, in China, they have been using herbal medicine, traditional herbal Chinese medicine, alongside Western approaches, and they've seen an improvement in outcomes in those patients that receive the herbal medicine. Mm-hmm. So considering different approaches that might be coming from a rationalistic approach rather than a completely empirical one. This is from a treatment perspective. The second thing that we could do is to really be more realistic and understand that, this is going to be with us for a while. Even in case we get a vaccine, and even in case the vaccine is efficacious, we are going to be living with this for another year and a half. And even if the vaccine is efficacious, it's going to be efficacious in a proportion of the population, not in everybody.
Thank you, Fabio. I think this has been really helpful, to get people to understand what the underlying problem is and how to approach this enemy with a little more clarity.
Thank you so much. I thought that was a really good discussion. Thank you for your questions.